When a poor schoolteacher's cabin burned to the ground, the town looked away. But miles away, a silent figure watched the smoke rise, a Comanche millionaire she once taught. And when he returned, he didn't just rebuild her school. He coated it in gold and buried the town's shame beneath it. The sky over Dust Whistle Ridge had always known smoke from homesteaders' chimneys, from wildfires that once rolled over plains like stampeding bison, and from battlefields, soaked in history's forgotten blood. But that morning, the smoke wasn't ancient. It was fresh, acrid, still biting as it curled into the heavens from what once stood as a small log. Cabin Miss Adeline Carter had taught there for 8 years. Her cabin wasn't much, just a one-room structure with peeling pine boards, a rusted stove in the corner, and shelves lined with donated books whose spines leaned like old men in the wind. She didn't teach for pay. Her salary, when it came, trickled in late and in crumpled bills. She taught because she believed that even children born on dirt floors could write themselves into history if given a pencil, a desk, and a hand, to guide them. But now her cabin was gone, swallowed by fire in the hush of midnight while she slept in the barn nursing a sick colt. It started in the walls, the old kindling dry timber catching flame fast. No one knew if it was lightning or something worse. All that was left were skeletal beams and ashes soaking in the morning dew. By noon, the townspeople had gathered, not with help, but with murmurs. Whispers floated through the crowd like dust motes. Maybe it was an accident. Or maybe the land just wanted her gone. One man muttered about back taxes, another about outsiders bringing trouble. But no one lifted a hammer, no one offered lumber, and no one looked her in the eyes. Adeline stood at the edge of the ruin, soot on her dress and grief in her throat. She didn't cry. The tears would have turned to steam anyway. She only picked through the debris slowly, her hands careful but steady. Beneath a charred rafter, she found her chalkboard slate, cracked but not broken. She pressed it to her chest and stared at the sky, the smoke now fading into blue. That was when the wind shifted, far off on the horizon. Where the plains gave way to the hard rock and ancient earth of Comanche territory, a convoy moved. It came without sound at first, the dust rising like ghosts from beneath the wheels of black-walled trucks and horses with braided manes. The lead vehicle was no ordinary wagon. It was a Cadillac, gleaming under the sun like a steel buffalo. Inside, it sat a man the town hadn't seen in years, and some had never seen at all. His name was Eli Red Bear. Long before oil wells and real estate turned him into a legend whispered through Texas business circles, Eli had been a barefoot boy herding goats on the res, listening to the wind like it carried secrets. He'd sat in Miss Carter's class once, back when she came every week to teach in the Comanche camp without pay. Crossing the river barefoot, her books tied in burlap, no one knew why he was coming now. The convoy passed silent houses, slowing. Only when it reached the burned remains of Adeline's schoolhouse. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His arrival was thunder without the storm, prophecy without a preacher. And the town held its breath. Miss Carter didn't recognize the vehicle at first, but when the door opened and Eli stepped out, tall, solemn, dressed in a black jacket, with beadwork stitched into the cuffs, her heart clenched. Not from fear, from memory. He then walked at her. He walked to the ashes. He bent down and picked up a half-burned book, its pages still warm. He opened it. It was Call of the Wild, and on the inside flap was a name, Eli R. Written in young, slanted handwriting years ago, in her class, Eli turned the page carefully. Then he closed the book, stood up, and looked to the land. Wind kicked up a wisp of ash, and in that moment, the first heartbeat of redemption pulsed through Dust Whistle Ridge. Eli didn't come with promises. He came with plans. And while the town would whisper louder now about money, about tribes, about who deserves what, something sacred had just begun. Something forged not in fire, but in memory, loyalty, and gold. Redemption wasn't a sermon or a statue. It was rising from ash with purpose, and Dust Whistle Ridge had just become its altar. Eli Red Bear didn't announce his intentions with fanfare or press. His first move wasn't a blueprint or a budget. It was silence. He stood for a long time at the edge of the ruin, watching the last curls of smoke die in the wind, letting the land speak to him before men did. Behind him, his men waited without. A word, their trucks idling softly, boots still dusty from the desert roads they had crossed. No one in town knew what to expect, and in truth, most were afraid. Dust Whistle Ridge wasn't a place that welcomed change. It tolerated survival, and only if it kept to its side of the tracks. Adeline Carter had always been a quiet irritant to some, a woman who gave too much, asked too little, and dared to believe that the children of Comanche laborers and dirt poor ranch hands deserved the same education as any banker's son. Her little cabin had stood like a defiant hymn, and now that it had burned, there were whispers that it should stay gone. At the general store, the men leaned against porch posts and sipped their coffee slow, pretending not to notice the sleek vehicles parked near the ruins. Mrs. Weber, the grocer's wife, whispered harshly that nothing good ever came in a black truck. Old Mr. Grady grunted and said it was only a matter of time before land like that got reclaimed. Only a few souls dared to step close. The pastor came by to offer a prayer, though his eyes flicked nervously at the Cadillac. Sheriff McAllister pulled up briefly, adjusted his hat, and asked Eli if he was planning to stay long, but didn't wait for an answer. The town wasn't hostile. It was worse. It was politely indifferent, the way only a place built on old secrets and quiet exclusions can be. Eli said nothing. Not to them, he turned to Adeline. She had barely spoken since the fire. Her face, streaked with soot and resolve, was unreadable. When their eyes met, a tremble passed between them, not of fear, but of recognition, the kind that only two people who walk through fire could share. And without words, she nodded. That night, Eli did not sleep in the lodge on the edge of town or in the fancy guest house the mayor's office offered. He set up camp by the ashes, a canvas tent, the stars overhead, just like when he was a boy, just like when he read books by candlelight outside his mother's hut and dreamed of something bigger than cattle auctions and hand-me-down shame. But his dreams had changed. Now they weren't for himself. They were for her school. For the ridge, he made a call that night. One call by dawn, machinery began to arrive. Flatbeds with lumber, not pine or fir, but imported mahogany and cedar. Trucks bearing copper sheeting, tempered glass, and barrels of oil-based gold lacquer paint. Out came stonecutters from Oklahoma, engineers from Austin, even to architects who specialized in sacred geometry. They weren't building a school. They were building a cathedral of learning. The ridge shook under the weight of progress, and with it, the town's quiet contempt began to stir. The mayor's office called 3 times to ensure zoning compliance. The bank manager paid an uninvited visit to advise on escrow implications. Even the newspaper editor, who hadn't covered the school fire at all, suddenly wanted to know if this was some kind of Comanche land reclamation scheme. Adeline watched it all from the edge of the site. She saw the questions come veiled in civility, wrapped in legalese, and saw how Eli answered them. Not with arguments, not with fire, but with action. Every brick laid was a sermon. Every arch carved was a declaration. This school wouldn't just return, it would rise in glory. But not everyone wanted glory. Some wanted quiet. On the 3rd day, a crude message was spray-painted on a shed near the edge of the construction site. Red Bear, go home. By dawn, the shed was gone, bulldozed, replaced with a rose garden planted by the children of the very people who'd once ignored the cabin altogether. The message was clear. This time, they wouldn't be erased, but beneath all the sound and motion, Adeline knew there was something deeper happening in Eli. He wasn't just rebuilding a structure, he was exercising something old buried in the town's soil, a hunger for justice that ran deeper than roots, a redemption born not from pity, but from memory. Eli hadn't come for applause, he'd come for reckoning, and the town that once looked away would soon be forced to look in the mirror. They said the Comanche never forgot, and Eli Red Bear was proof. Every stone laid on that scorched patch of earth seemed to carry a weight older than the town itself, not just the memory of a teacher's burnt-out school, but the voices of those who had long been silenced in the dry wind of the frontier. As foundations were poured, something else began to rise. Not just walls, but whispers. Both in the streets of Dust Whistle Ridge and in the conscience of its people. The construction site bloomed with the precision of a sacred ritual. Architects worked from dawn to dusk alongside tribal artisans, each brick chiseled with subtle native symbols, motifs of wind, fire, water, and learning. The main arch was etched with feathers that curled into the sky and above the doors. A bronze inscription was fixed. Knowledge is the fire that cannot be burned. Eli didn't just want to build a school, he wanted to carve a monument against forgetting. But the louder the vision became, the more Dustwhistle Ridge recoiled. The saloon, which once hosted poker nights and half-hearted town halls, now filled. With muttered resentment, "He's flaunting it," some said, making us look like fools. Others claimed Eli was laundering money, or worse, that this was political, that soon there'd be lawsuits or tribal flags flying above the post office. They couldn't stop him legally, but they could do what old towns did best: stall, whisper, and tighten their grip on the past. And yet, something had shifted. A quiet resistance began to form, not against Eli, but against the fear. A group of former students, grown now with children of their own, came forward to help. They cleared debris, cleaned bricks, planted seeds. One of them, a rancher named Lucas E., stood at the edge of the crowd during a heated town council meeting and simply said, "I learned to read under her roof. My boy will learn under this one." Adeline Carter stayed silent through most of it. She moved like a shadow between tents and beams, her hands often dusty, her eyes always alert. She'd spent years teaching children no one invested in, and now that her school was rising again, she knew how fragile momentum could be. She saw the way some folks stared too long at the trucks or stood too close to the electric tools, as if waiting for a moment to sabotage what they couldn't stop. But she also saw something else. The children had returned. They came not in uniforms or with lunch pails, but barefoot and wide-eyed, standing at the fences, watching the walls grow. Every day, a few more lingered after their chores, asking questions, helping to paint. Eli welcomed them with a quiet nod. He had hired security, but not to keep people out, to keep dignity in. He protected the site like sacred ground because, for him, it was every inch of concrete, buried the memory of a boy turned away. Every ounce of gold trim was a reminder that no people, no matter how forgotten, were ever beyond revival. Still, adversity came, just not from where he expected. A state official arrived unannounced. Clipboard in hand, smile fixed like a mask. He claimed there were zoning violations, environmental concerns. But when pressed, his tone turned. "There are people," he said vaguely, "who don't like this kind of attention on a place like Dustwhistle." Eli didn't flinch. He simply pointed to the burned remains, still framed behind a sheet of glass, left untouched as a relic of what once was. That, he said coldly, wasn't zoned either. The man left without a signature. But the message was clear. The town wasn't just uncomfortable with progress, it was terrified of being rewritten. To them, Eli Redbear wasn't just building a school, he was digging up bones of history. Of guilt, of the silent complicity that allowed a fire to consume a legacy without consequence. Still, the work went on. One evening, just before the sun dipped below the hills, the roof was completed. It wasn't shingled in tar or clay, but a composite gold, bright enough to glint against the setting light. It shone like a beacon, catching the attention of every soul in Dustwhistle Ridge. Some turned their eyes away in shame, others stared, as if witnessing prophecy, and far beyond the town. In the Red Hills, where Eli's ancestors once rode through mist and gunfire, a fire was lit, not of destruction, but of remembrance. The Comanche knew the ridge was rising. Redemption was no longer a whisper. It was a building crowned in gold. And soon, it would speak. It began not with thunder, but with silence, the kind of silence that presses heavy against the skin, that settles into the bones of a town just before something breaks. Dustwhistle Ridge had always been a place where storms came in two forms, the ones that cracked the skies open, and the ones that moved through men's hearts. And this time, both were coming. The school stood finished now, glowing like firelight. Against the dusky plains, with gold-tinted roofing, carved cedar doorways, and a bell tower that reached like a finger toward heaven. It looked more like a temple than a classroom. Children had begun to gather daily, though no official ribbon had yet been cut. Adeline Carter had resumed her silent walk from the barn house to the steps every morning, wearing the same threadbare shawl and the same look of guarded hope. But hope unsettles the kind of men who thrive on control. In the saloon, the whispers had turned sharp. Names were thrown around: Eli Redbear, Adeline Carter, even the children's. And with them came warnings. This town's being bought. They're trying to erase us. No one asked for a golden school. Jealousy fermented with old prejudice, and beneath the veneer of politeness, something rotted. And rot always finds a crack. That crack came during the first storm. On a Thursday night, the sky split open. Rain hammered the roof of the new school. Thunder rolled like distant drums, and wind howled through the canyons. It was a violent storm, the kind that reminded the ridge it was still ruled by nature first. But it wasn't lightning that caused the damage. It was a man. Sometime before dawn, someone cut the power to the site. By morning, the security cameras were blind. The golden trim on the east wing had been slashed with acid, and the front doors, those magnificent double arches of polished mahogany, had been smeared with oil and ash in the shape of a crude X dot. No one claimed it. No one needed to. The message was loud enough. You're not welcome. Eli Redbear didn't make a statement. He gathered his crew, surveyed the damage, and simply ordered the repairs. Stronger doors, cameras hardwired off-grid, and a new symbol etched into the rebuilt steps. A phoenix, wings open, carved in stone. But Adeline felt the deeper wound. She had lived long enough in the ridge to know that violence in a small town rarely ends where it starts. She could see the shift in the children's eyes, the fear returning, the questions unspoken. Would they be safe here? Was knowledge really worth fighting for? Then came the second storm. This time, it wasn't weather. A petition circulated quietly, signed by over 30 townsfolk, some of whom had once sent pies to Adeline's porch, others who had sat in her pews on Sundays. The petition demanded the school be shut down until proper state reviews could be conducted. It called the building an eyesore, a disruption, and a divisive project not reflective of Ridge values. They delivered it to the mayor, who folded it politely and filed it with trembling hands. That same evening, a letter arrived at Eli's tent from the State Board of Education. A review was, in fact, being scheduled. Inspectors would be arriving within the week. For a moment, it felt like the wind had been knocked from the sails. Even the sky stayed gray for days. But something stirred beneath the stillness. It was Lucas. Again, the rancher, the former student, who took it upon himself to stand at the town square with a worn sign. She taught me to read. Let our children dream. He stood there all morning. Then he was joined by 2 more, then 5, then 20. The ridge wasn't monolithic after all. The old men in the saloon grumbled, but the farmers' wives sent meals. To the construction workers, the mechanic offered to service Eli's convoy at no cost. One of the most powerful families in town, whose own child had secretly attended Adeline's school under a false name to avoid bullying, came forward and made a public donation. It wasn't about sides anymore. It was about what kind of town Dustwhistle Ridge wanted to be when the inspectors arrived. They were met not with cold files or paperwork, but with the hum of children reading beneath stained glass windows, with the smell of fresh chalk and wildflowers, with the echo of a bell that had rung in honor, not defiance. And when one inspector asked Adeline what curriculum she planned to use, she simply handed over a single notebook, handwritten, every page filled with stories from her former students. It was more than enough. The storm had come, but the school still stood, and now its roots were deeper than ever, not just in gold or stone, but in a community learning, at last, to remember itself. In the middle of the school's courtyard stood a bell tower, tall, solemn, and cast from repurposed metal pulled from abandoned mining equipment donated by elders from the Comanche plains. Eli Redbear had insisted it be made by hand. He didn't want it molded in silence. He wanted it forged in memory. And when the final hammer strike cooled its frame, they hoisted it high, anchoring it above the arch where students would one day gather beneath. It rang only once before the threats came. Not long after, the inspectors gave their reluctant approval. A new group emerged, quieter, meaner, and with no face. They never signed petitions. They didn't argue at council meetings. They acted. Small things at first. Slashed tires on worker trucks, dead animals left at the construction gate, bricks thrown through a back window in the night. No one ever saw them, but everyone knew they were there. And the message, though unspoken, was clear. This school is not welcome. But that bell kept ringing, every morning at 7 o'clock. Adeline Carter pulled the cord with her frail hands and let the sound echo over the plains. It wasn't just to call students, it was a declaration, a statement of survival. And as long as it rang, the people of Dust Whistle Ridge, even those who hated it, were forced to hear it. That morning, as frost clung to the porch rails and the sun burned low over the ridgeline, the bell was silent. The rope had been cut, found it coiled at the foot of the tower, like a snake sleeping after the strike. For the first time since the school had risen, she didn't climb the steps. She stood beneath them, silent, looking up at the bronze dome above. Eli arrived moments later, saying nothing. He didn't ask who did it. He didn't need to. Dust Whistle Ridge was old. It had buried too many truths to be shocked now. But what Eli did next shook the very breath from the town. He walked to the square. He stood before the old courthouse, the same one that once refused to register Comanche births, the same one that fined Adeline for teaching without official curriculum. Back in '98, and he called for a gathering. No microphone, no banners, just his voice. They came slowly, not out of curiosity, but out of obligation. Even the reluctant came, even the ones who had hurled paint or whispers or doubt. And when they had gathered, Eli lifted something from behind him, the broken rope. He held it high. Then he dropped it. And in the silence that followed, he spoke. Not in anger, not in blame, but in memory. He told them about the boy he had been, the one who couldn't pronounce dignity, but knew what it felt like to sit at the edge of a classroom and not be turned away. He told them how Adeline Carter crossed rivers, barefoot, to teach children whose names weren't even in town records, how the first book he ever touched was from her shelf, and how everything he became, from oilman to philanthropist, began in a room no bigger than a stable. Then he turned, his eyes to the school behind them. He didn't plead. He didn't threaten. He simply said, "That bell will ring tomorrow. Whether the first climb that tower or burn it down and build it again. But it will ring, not for me, for the ones you still pretend not to see." And then he walked away. The next morning, the bell rang. No one knew who fixed it. The rope was new, stronger, tied with precision. Some said it was Lucas. Others claimed a child did it. But when it rang louder than it ever had before. And this time, the wind carried it farther across the canyon, over the river, and deep into the bones of a town long taught to forget what it owed. That day, something shifted. Not everyone changed, but those who did mattered more. The butcher who once refused to serve, Comanche families now offered free lunch to the children. The sheriff, who had only ever visited the ridge to check things out, started walking children across the road. During school hours, even the grocer's wife, who had once warned about black trucks, baked a pie and left it on Adeline's desk with no note. No apology, just a pie and silence. The school's bell became a compass, and every morning it pointed toward a different kind of ridge. Not perfect, but rising, the wind had always carried dust across the plains of Dust Whistle Ridge, soft at times, biting at others, as if the land itself were whispering stories too old for the living to understand. But now, something new moved with the wind. It wasn't sorrow, it wasn't silence. It was the sound of redemption settling into the bones of a place that had long tried to outrun its past. The school stood, finished now in every way that mattered. Its golden roof gleamed, not as a trophy, but as a symbol, one earned through fire, resistance, and memory. Children walked its halls with heads high, their shadows cast across polished floors and glass murals that told stories once buried. In hush, each corner of the building echoed with new life, new voices, and a kind of hope that couldn't be bought, only fought for. Adeline Carter, now grayer and slower in her step, taught beneath vaulted ceilings carved with stories of wind and fire. Her chalk scraped the board like a hymn. Every lesson was a tribute, every student a living monument. She no longer walked alone. She no longer taught in whispers. The Golden School, as the children now called it, was not just hers. It belonged to every soul brave enough to believe that knowledge was worth the war. And Eli Redbear, he didn't stay. One morning after the first semester ended, he stood on the ridge where the school's bell tower rose against the sky and looked down over the town. His convoy stood quietly behind him, engines hushed. He wore no suit that day. Just jeans, boots, and the weathered jacket of a man who'd traveled too far to be called a guest. He didn't speak to the crowd that gathered behind him, curious. He didn't take a final bow. He simply placed a feather on the cornerstone, a red-tailed hawk's feather, long and smooth, and whispered a word in Comanche. Then he walked away. He left behind no plaque, no portrait, just a legacy. But Dust Whistle Ridge would never forget him. Weeks later, the town's paper, which had once ignored the burning of the original school, ran a front-page story titled "The Man Who Rebuilt the Ridge." It featured a photo, not of Eli, but of Adeline standing at her desk, surrounded by children laughing. The caption read, "What they tried to erase became gold." That winter, a light snow fell over the plains, dusting the golden roof in white. Like a crown, parents who had once crossed the street to avoid Adeline now gathered on the school's steps for holiday programs. Children whose ancestors had been kept from education now read stories aloud in both English and Comanche. Even the mayor, once silent, sent a formal apology, not in words, but by offering the old town hall to be turned into a library annex, stocked with every title Adeline requested. The transformation wasn't dramatic, it was deliberate, because redemption isn't always a firestorm. Sometimes it's the slow return of dignity in a place that tried to forget its heart. In the years that followed, the school would win awards, but it wasn't the medals on the walls that mattered. It was the girl who found her voice in poetry, the boy who solved equations after years of being called slow, the child who stood at the bell tower one morning and asked Adeline if he could be a teacher one day, just like her, and she smiled the first real smile in a long time and nodded. There was gold in the dust now, not in coins or glory, but in stories rebuilt, in children reborn, and in a town that finally faced its own reflection and didn't look away. Redemption didn't come roaring. It came in the ring of a bell,